There is something most people will never admit. Being alone frightens them. Not the practical kind of alone. Not the temporary kind, the evening by yourself, the quiet commute, the lunch eaten without company. Those are easy. Those pass quickly. Those can be filled with a phone screen or background noise before the discomfort ever has time to form. The kind of alone that frightens people is different. It is the kind that requires you to sit with yourself in complete silence. No distraction. No performance. No one to reflect a version of you back at you. Just you, your thoughts, and the unfiltered reality of who you actually are when no one is watching. Most people never go there voluntarily. And the ones who do, the ones who learn to not only tolerate that space but to live inside it deliberately, become a fundamentally different kind of person. The Stoics did not stumble onto this truth accidentally. They arrived at it through careful observation of human nature, through philosophy, and through the hard experience of men who had lived at the highest levels of power and pressure that civilization had ever produced. What they found, again and again, was this. The person who cannot be alone is always, in some essential way, dependent. Dependent on the presence of others to feel real. Dependent on external noise to avoid internal silence. Dependent on the approval and attention and energy of other people to feel like they are enough. And dependence, the Stoics understood, is the enemy of freedom. This video is about solitude. About what it actually is, what it actually does, and why the people who learn to master it, truly master it, not just endure it, consistently become the most grounded, most powerful, and most genuinely free human beings in any room they enter. Solitude is not what most people think it is. When most people hear the word solitude, they hear loneliness wearing a philosophical disguise. They imagine it as something to be endured rather than chosen. A condition imposed by circumstances, by rejection, by social failure, by the absence of people who want your company. And because that association exists so deeply in most people's psychology, they resist solitude even when it is available. They feel guilty when they enjoy it. They apologize for wanting it. They fill it as quickly as possible with something, anything, that prevents them from having to actually be alone with their own mind. But solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. The difference between them is not the absence of people. The difference is entirely internal. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted separation. It is the ache of wanting connection and not having it. It is imposed from outside and experienced as loss. Solitude is the power of chosen aloneness. It is not the absence of connection, it is the presence of yourself. It is the deliberate decision to enter a space where your own thoughts, values, and inner life can exist without the constant interference of other people's needs, opinions, and noise. Marcus Aurelius understood this distinction completely. He was Emperor of Rome, one of the most socially demanding positions in human history. He was surrounded by senators, generals, advisors, supplicants, and courtiers every hour of every day. He had less practical solitude than almost any person alive. And yet, he built an entire internal world of solitude that no external circumstance could touch. The Meditations, his private journals, were never written for publication. They were never written for an audience. They were written for himself alone, in the small hours of the morning, in military camps, in quiet moments stolen from the relentless demands of empire. That internal solitude, that private space he maintained within himself regardless of how many people surrounded him, was, in his own estimation, the source of everything. The source of his clarity. The source of his discipline. The source of his ability to govern without being consumed by the role. Solitude is not a place you go. It is a practice you build. And the people who build it most deliberately are the ones who discover that they need other people's energy far less than they once believed, and that the energy they generate for themselves in silence is more sustaining than anything they were ever given from outside. Dependence on others is a form of weakness the Stoics refused. Epictetus was a slave. Not metaphorically. Literally. A man born into absolute legal ownership by another person, with no freedom, no rights, and no control over the external circumstances of his life. And yet, he became one of the most influential philosophers in human history. His teachings on freedom, inner power, and self-mastery have outlived empires, influenced emperors, and shaped the thinking of some of the most psychologically resilient human beings who have ever existed. How? Because Epictetus understood something about freedom that most free people never grasp. That external freedom, the freedom of circumstances, the freedom of social approval, the freedom from other people's control, is always conditional. It can be taken. It can be revoked. It depends on factors you do not govern. But internal freedom, the freedom of your own mind, your own judgment, your own response to whatever life presents, that is unconditional. It cannot be taken because it does not exist in a world where taking is possible. It exists only inside you. And solitude, Epictetus taught, is the practice ground for that internal freedom. When you are alone, truly alone, without the constant social feedback loop that most people rely on to know what to think and how to feel, you are forced to develop your own judgment. Your own values. Your own sense of what matters and what does not. You are forced, in the most productive sense of that word, to become your own authority. The person who has never done this work is always dependent. Always needing to check how their choices register with others before they can feel settled in them. Always waiting for external confirmation before they can act on internal conviction. Always, at some level, outsourcing their sense of reality to the people around them. That kind of dependence is not a personality trait. It is a practiced condition. It was built through years of seeking approval, of adjusting behavior based on social feedback, of learning to locate the sense of self in external reflection rather than internal substance. And it can be unbuilt. Through the same slow process by which it was constructed, through practice. Specifically through the practice of being alone long enough, and intentionally enough, to rediscover that you are a complete and sufficient source of your own authority. This does not mean becoming isolated. It does not mean withdrawing from the world or treating other people as threats to your solitude. It means building a relationship with your own inner life that is strong enough that you do not need others to complete it. That you can move into connection from a place of genuine choice rather than desperate necessity. That you can be fully present with people because you are already full, not because you are hoping they will fill you. That is what the Stoics meant by inner freedom. Not the absence of relationship. The presence of wholeness that makes genuine relationship possible. What happens to the mind in solitude? The mind most people carry into daily life is not their own. That is not an exaggeration. It is a description of what actually happens when a human being spends most of their waking hours in constant social input, surrounded by other people's opinions, absorbing other people's anxieties, performing a version of themselves for various audiences.
Consuming an endless stream of other people's thoughts through screens and conversations and ambient noise. Under those conditions, the mind does not generate thought, processes input, it reacts, performs, compares, competes, adjusts and responds, but it rarely, in any meaningful sense, actually thinks. Genuine thinking requires space. It requires the absence of immediate social pressure. It requires the permission to arrive at a conclusion that no one asked for, that no one else might agree with, that exists simply because your mind worked through something honestly and came out the other side with a position. That kind of thinking almost never happens in company. It happens in solitude. Marcus Aurelius wrote his clearest insights not in Senate chambers or military councils but alone, before dawn, in private. Seneca wrote his most powerful letters, works that have shaped Western philosophy for 2,000 years, in deliberate withdrawal from the social life of Rome, which he found both stimulating and corrosive. Epictetus taught in a school but insisted that his students practice long periods of silent reflection precisely because he knew the teaching itself could not complete the transformation. Only the student's own private confrontation with their own mind could do that. The Stoics were not the only ones who understood this. Every tradition of genuine wisdom, philosophical, contemplative, or otherwise, has recognized the same essential truth. The deepest layers of the human mind are accessible only in silence. And the people who never go into silence never reach those layers. They live their entire lives on the surface, reactive, performance-driven, shaped primarily by external input rather than internal conviction. What happens when you enter sustained solitude deliberately? First, discomfort. The mind that has been trained on constant input does not immediately welcome its absence. It searches for stimulation. It generates anxiety. It reaches for the phone. It finds reasons to end the quiet. This phase is real and it is temporary, and it is also, the Stoics would say, the most revealing thing you will ever observe about the state of your own mental dependency. Then, gradually, something else. A settling, a slowing. The noise that was always present, the internal chatter, the rehearsed conversations, the ambient social anxiety, begins to thin, not disappear, thin. And in the space that opens, something closer to actual thought begins to emerge. This is where genuine self-knowledge lives. Not in therapy, not in conversation, not in the words other people use to describe you, but in the unmediated experience of your own mind in silence. What it returns to when distraction is removed. What it actually values when performance is not required. What it fears when there is no one to reassure it. What it loves when there is no one to impress. That knowledge is the foundation of everything the Stoics considered worth building. Character, judgment, genuine strength. None of it is accessible without the willingness to go inside and stay there long enough for the real material to surface. The relationship between solitude and genuine confidence. Most people misunderstand confidence. They believe it is a feeling, something that arrives from outside, from success, from validation, from the accumulation of evidence that you are capable and worthwhile. And so they pursue it outwardly. They look for proof in other people's reactions. They build it on the foundation of external feedback. They maintain it through constant social reinforcement. That kind of confidence is real, but it is fragile, because it is built on a foundation that can shift. When the feedback changes, when failure arrives, when criticism comes, when the social environment turns, the confidence built on external evidence crumbles. Because the foundation was never yours. It was borrowed. The Stoics described something different. Not the confidence that comes from accumulating positive external evidence, but the confidence that comes from knowing yourself completely and choosing yourself deliberately. The confidence of a person who has spent enough time alone to know exactly what they believe, what they value, what they will and will not do, and who therefore does not need external confirmation before acting on that knowledge. That kind of confidence cannot be taken by changed circumstances. It does not depend on outcomes. It does not require the room to agree with you before you can feel certain. It exists prior to the result, because it is built not on what you have done or what others think of you, but on the direct experience of your own inner substance. And that inner substance is only discovered in solitude. You cannot find out who you are in company. In company, you are always, to some degree, performing, adapting, responding to the social field around you, reading the room, adjusting your expression, your position, your energy to fit the context. In solitude, none of that is required. And without it, what remains is something closer to the truth of who you actually are. Most people find that confrontation uncomfortable at first, because who they actually are, without the social performance, sometimes turns out to be different from who they have been telling themselves and others they are. The values they discover in silence are sometimes different from the values they have been publicly displaying. The fears that surface when distraction is removed are sometimes more fundamental than the anxieties they have been managing in public. But that confrontation, uncomfortable as it is the beginning of something the Stoics considered the most important work a human being can do. The work of knowing yourself honestly, not the performed version, not the socially curated version, the actual one. And from that honest self-knowledge, a very different kind of confidence becomes possible. Not the confidence that says, I have been told I am good at this, but the confidence that says, I know exactly who I am, what I value, and what I am capable of. And I know this not because someone confirmed it, but because I went inside and found it myself. That confidence does not announce itself. It does not need to. It is visible in the way a person moves, in the quality of their silence, in the absence of the defensive gestures, the over-explaining, the people-pleasing, the constant social calibration that characterize people who have never built it. History's most powerful people were defined by their solitude. This is not a metaphor. It is a consistent pattern across the lives of the people history identifies as having achieved something genuine. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who governed the Roman Empire through plague, war, and political instability, attributed his capacity to endure and function to the private philosophical practice he maintained alone, before dawn, every day of his adult life. Without that practice, he wrote, he would have been consumed by the role. With it, he remained, in some essential way, himself. Seneca, one of Rome's most influential minds, a man who moved through the highest corridors of power and the lowest points of exile, wrote that the time he valued most was not the time spent in senatorial debate or court performance, but the hours of private reading, writing, and reflection that no one else witnessed. He described those hours not as preparation for the public work, but as the substance from which the public work drew everything. Epictetus, a freed slave turned philosopher whose school produced some of the most resilient minds of the ancient world, insisted that the foundation of everything he taught was not the lectures or the discussions, but the private practice of each student in solitude, thinking through their own beliefs, confronting their own fears, building their own relationship with their own inner authority. The pattern holds beyond the Stoics. Newton developed the foundations of modern physics during 2 years of enforced isolation during a plague, a period he later called the most productive of his life. Darwin spent decades in deliberate withdrawal from London society at Down House, where the quiet of his daily walks and solitary hours produced the theory that would reshape humanity's understanding of itself. Einstein described his best thinking as emerging from private reverie, what he called thought experiments conducted alone, in silence, in the space between social demands. These were not people who were alone because no one wanted their company. They were people who understood, through experience, that certain kinds of thinking, the kind that produces genuine insight rather than social performance, require a quality of inner quiet that company makes impossible. And they protected that quiet fiercely, not out of misanthropy, not out of social failure, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the solitude was not separate from their power. It was the source of it. How to build the practice. Understanding why solitude matters is one thing. Building a genuine practice of it is another. The difficulty for most people is not conceptual. They understand, at least intellectually, that time alone might be valuable. The difficulty is practical and psychological, because in a world structured almost entirely around constant connection, where the phone is always available, where social input is always accessible, where being unreachable carries a social cost, choosing solitude requires a kind of countercultural deliberateness that most people are not accustomed to exercising. The Stoics would recognize the challenge. Seneca wrote extensively about the difficulty of withdrawing from a social world that constantly pulls at attention. He was not describing an ancient problem. He was describing a human one. The pull toward company, toward stimulation, toward the comfort of other people's presence is real and deep. It does not disappear simply because you have decided intellectually that solitude would serve you. What changes it is practice. Incremental, consistent, unglamorous practice. The practical method begins small, not with dramatic retreats or extended isolation, though those have value, but with the daily reclamation of small periods of genuine quiet. 20 minutes in the morning before the phone is consulted. A walk without earphones. A meal without a screen. A drive in silence. These small windows, practiced consistently, begin to rebuild the tolerance for solitude that constant stimulation has eroded. In those windows, the practice is simple. Not meditation in any formal sense. Simply presence. Noticing what the mind does when distraction is removed. What it returns to. What anxieties surface. What genuinely interests it when there is no social performance required. Over time, what most people discover is that the discomfort of those early moments, the restlessness, the impulse to reach for stimulation, gradually diminishes. The mind that was trained on constant input slowly learns to generate its own. Thoughts become more complete. Observations become more precise. The sense of internal life, of being a person with a genuine inner world rather than simply a social surface, begins to thicken. And alongside that, something else shifts. The need for constant social presence, the low-level anxiety about missing connection, about being unreachable, about existing outside the loop, begins to quiet. Not disappear. Quiet. The world continues. The connections that matter continue. But the desperation that attached itself to them, the sense that without constant connection something essential would be lost, gradually reveals itself for what it always was. Not a genuine need. Practiced dependency. Breaking that dependency is not comfortable. But what is on the other side of it is something the Stoics considered the most important possession a human being can have. A self. A genuine, internally generated, thoroughly examined, quietly confident self. That does not require constant external input to feel real. That does not need other people's presence to feel whole. That carries its own weight, generates its own authority, and meets the world and the people in it from a place of fundamental completeness rather than fundamental need. The paradox. Solitude makes you better with people. Here is the thing most people never expect. The more genuinely comfortable you become with being alone, the better you become at being with others. This seems counterintuitive. The assumption most people carry is that social skill comes from social practice. That the more time you spend with people, the better you become at connecting with them. And there is truth in that at a surface level. But deeper connection, the kind that actually nourishes rather than simply passes the time, requires something that constant sociality actually erodes. Presence. When you have never genuinely been alone, when you are always slightly dependent on company for your sense of completeness, you cannot fully be present with the people in your life, because you are not fully there with them. Part of you is always managing the connection, monitoring whether they still like you, calculating what to say next, performing a version of yourself you believe they find acceptable, needing something from the interaction that genuine presence would not require. When you have built a genuine practice of solitude, when you have met yourself honestly in quiet and found that you are sufficient, something changes in the way you are with other people. You are no longer managing them. You are no longer performing for them. You are no longer extracting from them. You are simply there, present, interested, without agenda, and people feel that. The same way they feel the anxiety of the person who needs them. They feel the freedom of the person who does not, and they find it not cold, not distant, but profoundly relaxing. Because most people spend most of their time in social interactions that are, at some level, transactional, where both parties are managing and performing and extracting and needing. The person who comes into a room already whole, already sufficient, without needing anything from it, brings a quality of presence that is genuinely rare. And that presence, without any deliberate effort to command it, generates exactly the kind of quiet authority and genuine respect that no amount of social performance can manufacture. That is the deepest paradox of solitude. The person who is most at home alone is often the most genuinely connected when they choose to be with others, because their connection comes from abundance rather than need, from genuine interest rather than managed dependency, from the fullness of a person who has spent enough time alone to know themselves, and who meets others from that knowledge rather than in search of it. There is a version of you that only exists in silence. It is not a hidden version. It is not a secret one. It is the most fundamental one, the one that exists beneath the performance, beneath the social adaptation, beneath the years of adjusting and managing and presenting yourself for various audiences. Most people never meet that version of themselves. Not because it is inaccessible, because they never stop long enough to let it surface, because the silence required to find it feels too uncomfortable to enter voluntarily, because the world is designed to fill that silence before it can do its work. The Stoics were not asking for anything complicated. They were asking for what Marcus Aurelius practiced before dawn in a military camp, what Seneca protected in the hours between public obligations, what Epictetus taught his students to find in private reflection. A few moments each day, a few degrees of genuine withdrawal from constant input, the willingness to be alone with yourself long enough to find out who that actually is. It is uncomfortable at first. That is not a reason to avoid it. That discomfort is the mind recalibrating, rebuilding the capacity it was always meant to have, learning to generate from within what it was trained to seek from outside. And on the other side of that recalibration, not distant, not dramatic, but real, is the version of you that does not need approval to feel real, that does not need noise to feel alive, that does not need other people's presence to feel whole. That version of you is the most powerful one you will ever find. And it is waiting in the quiet. Go there.